Welcome to We Have a Spiritual Problem, a podcast exploring the interconnections between personal wellness, societal challenges, and spiritual growth. My guest today is Becky Blue, acclaimed author of Turning, The Magic and Mystery of More Days. Becky brings a fresh and inspiring perspective on aging, challenging the stereotypes of a youth-obsessed culture and encouraging us to embrace life's third act with grace, joy, and purpose. Becky discusses the profound power of relationships and the harm of anti-aging narratives. We discuss why our perception of age is a spiritual problem and how celebrating aging and fostering intergenerational relationships can connect us and enrich our communities. Becky, welcome to the We Have a Spiritual Problem podcast. You were a recent guest on the Aging Well podcast, and it was obvious during that conversation that we had a lot more to explore on the spiritual aspect of aging. And we introduced your book, Turning, and I want you just to kind of introduce that again for the guests that maybe did not see that podcast, and just tell us a little bit about who you are, and we'll just jump in from there.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. It's really fun to be back with you. I'm looking forward to this conversation. My background is in nursing, and my most recent part of my career prior to retiring, I was in faith community nursing. And so that was the way we do it here in South Dakota, is you're helping nurses get started in churches. And so one of the things that we always taught our nurses was to really look at clients' body, mind, and spirit. So at some point in the podcast, I'm sure we'll talk a little more about that view, which is helpful for everybody, I think. So anyway, I'm a nurse, and the reason the book came about, I'll just pop it up here. It's called Turning, the Magic and Mystery of More Days. Was I had retired, but I was doing some writing on a blog, and then I was approaching my 60th birthday. And as anybody who's done this, or certainly hit one of those milestone birthdays with a 0 on the end, you get a little reflective, or a lot reflective, and people, your friends, kind of approach it differently. And I thought, okay, I can help my friends and myself approach my 60th birthday, because I'm also a trained geriatric nurse, and I know a lot about aging. So I just started writing, and it ended up being something that was useful to me and I thought would be useful to others. So I ended up putting it in a book.
So you mentioned nursing and how it kind of led you to a bit more of a body, mind, spirit approach. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How would you describe your spiritual or philosophical perspective and how that has shaped your worldview?
Well, you don't mind, can I read a little bit from my book?
Absolutely, please.
I have marked it. Okay. Because I really like this model, and I actually learned it from a theologian. And I'll be open, my book is, there's a lot of spiritual components to my book, but I'm also very open about everybody defines spirituality differently. So I appreciate that you asked the question. My favorite way to define spirit is by asking the question, what is your heart pinned to? The answer can't be nothing, because everyone's heart is pinned to something. It might be Jesus or a different higher being in your personal faith tradition, but it may also be your family, job, food, shopping, or an unending grief. I truly believe we are all a mixed bag of body, mind, and spirit stuff, and our natural tendency is to weigh it all on our birthdays.
Beautiful.
Yeah, so that kind of idea that I got from Stephen Paulson, a theologian, he talked about, what is your heart pinned to? And so that's a great question to ask someone if you're kind of wanting to dig into their spirituality. And of course, we have so many things coming at us, and so many parts of our life that kind of take over. And sometimes we don't really acknowledge that, oh, yeah, I need to look at the bigger picture, or see what the bigger energy source, if you will, could be for my life. I'm not going to probably find this life of abundance just through my love of a certain TV show, or my love of following a certain celebrity, or my love of social media, that somewhere I have to find that energy. And I think that's how you really draw on that spirit within yourself.
Your book is really about approaching aging and the challenges that come with that, particularly as a female, because I think as males, we're allowed a little bit more freedom in getting old, and women are faced with social media and celebrities that are getting Botox and this lifted and that filled with whatever. And it really affects the self-image of women in particular, but all of us as we age. And we have, I think we talked about this in the other podcast, we have some issues with how we approach aging in this country and maybe even globally. I mean, we're probably worse in the U.S. than other countries when it comes to how we deal with our aging population and how we approach each birthday. So when you hear the phrase, we have a spiritual problem, what does that mean to you? And how does it kind of apply to the topics that you address in your book?
Yeah, I think we have a spiritual problem. I agree with that statement. And I think I'll go back to that model of we are all whole beings, body, mind, and spirit. And I think what you're describing about what Madison Avenue or the culture tells us about aging is it's all about your body. That's what we're going to notice about aging is the changes in your body. And, that's absolutely true. I certainly believe there's a lot of those things that we can sort of stall out. And you're a great one to talk about that, related to exercise and movement. I mean, that's really the key. But also mind. I think sometimes we're focused on, oh my gosh, I'm starting to forget things or I can't find the words, which is kind of typical. Our brain gets a little less, the plasticity of it. But so often we just kind of forget about the spiritual part. And to me, if we do focus on that spiritual part, which to me is where that deep meaning is in life, that if you open up or feed that part of your soul, if you let your spirit respond day to day, that you will not maybe worry so much about the body part or the mind part, but that spirit, what it does for me, and I believe this to be true, is that it helps me to look outside myself and look at the rest of the world and see what my neighbor needs or what my family needs and think about them more than thinking about myself.
Which to me is the definition of spirituality, is that sense that there's something bigger than self, and
Absolutely.
trying to give to that outer community and join with that connectedness. And so as you wrote the book, did you find that your spiritual self changed in any way?
Oh, I love that. I did. I think what came to me is more of kind of a calmness, I guess, about aging and understanding that I can still have a very full life, even though some of these things are happening maybe to my mind and body. And if I lean into that spirit part a little more, that's where that abundant life happens. And I certainly talk a lot in my book about, taking time to experience those things that have maybe been waiting in the wings or things that have been on the back burner of your life and that maybe even in the corner of your soul that you almost forgot about. So an example being, I started taking ballet a couple years ago, and I might have talked about that in our last podcast.
I was going to ask you about that again.
Yeah. And so I'm certainly not a ballerina, but maybe I could call myself that. I take ballet with other adults, and it gets me my goal of having good balance and good posture and strength. So it's a wonderful form of exercise. But there's also something very spiritual about being in those classes. The music resonates with me, the kind of music, this classical music, which I love. It feeds my soul. And the new friendships that I've made. And I have this kind of rule that I need to have a friend from every decade. And so I've met some friends who are in their 20s, who are in my ballet class, 30s, 40s, 50s. I happen to be 65. And so we could go into a whole thing about friendship and spirituality, right? I mean, we know that is such a fire for spiritualities if you connect with the right people. So back to your question, Yeah, I think my book, and I try to use it as kind of a field guide to my own aging, that it's kind of guided me. And I feel really happy. I would just say that I'm very happy at 65 and excited for what can come next.
In your book, is it intended for those of us that have just kind of crested the 60s, or do you feel, your friends that are in their 20s and 30s can benefit from the book as they begin to look forward and plan for, what comes next in our lives?
Yeah, I think it definitely could resonate with people who are younger. I've had people who are younger come to my book signings and get the book. Oftentimes, it's under the guise of, "Well, I'm going to give this to my mom," which is great. The other thing I really love is I've had some family members, like they'll do an intergenerational book study together. So it'll be grandma, mom, and granddaughter, or I mean, it certainly be for the male gender as well. Um, so I love that because the end of each chapter has some really great in-depth or kind of soul-searching questions at the end of each chapter.
So it's spiritual throughout, right? It kind of follows
It
my
is,
principle of SPIES, the spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social.
yeah, and that's I think when we say we have a spiritual problem, I think we're just kind of ignoring the fact that we are spiritual beings, and so every day we should kind of be recognizing that, like, okay, at this moment, what is my heart pinned to? Am I more whooped up about the politics on TV, or should I be walking across the street and knocking on my neighbor's door and saying, "Hey, let's have coffee"?
So do you think, this, well, any spiritual problem really, but even just the difficulties that we have with age and with aging, that it's connected to a bit more of a lack of meaning, a lack of community or purpose in people's lives? And if so, why or why not?
I think for some people, that can certainly be the case. I guess I would kind of put that on some other generations more than maybe the older generation. I feel like we are, and I'm finding as I get more to this phase of life and as I watch my friends as well, they are looking for more meaning or they're more comfortable, like getting into those deeper conversations more quickly, maybe doing some new experiences. So I think it's kind of an individual thing. I don't think it's something that we just say is part of getting older, but I do think that if you look at your life and you realize, oh, I'm feeling kind of stagnant or I'm feeling kind of stuck. I think looking at spirituality in whatever form that might be, if you're going to, uh, get back to a place of worship that you haven't been to before, or if you're going to do a deep dive into some books that talk about faith or spirituality. Um, I think the other thing that we haven't talked about is creativity, and I feel like creativity is just mostly spirituality, right? I think
Right.
they're so connected. And if you want to look at it from a faith perspective, when you look at you know God creating the earth, I mean that's extremely holy. And so anytime I think that you create something, whether it be art or a poem or whatever, if you're building something, that those are holy moments and those are spiritual moments. And so that's another way to feed your spirituality.
Yeah, this podcast kind of sparked from a conversation I had with Lauren Axelrod, who wrote the book 10 Words, and it's a much longer title, but I'll stick with just the 10 words. And her
Mm.
10 words were attention, acceptance, authenticity, and I always switch these two. So it's benevolence, balance, and then contemplation, and then creativity comes right after that contemplation. And then
Mm.
from that becomes cooperation, celebration, and care. And,
Mm.
it's interesting how those words all just kind of feed our growth in our spirituality, that we have to be attentive to not only our needs, but the needs of others. And we have to accept things the way they are. And
Mhm.
everything kind of builds
Mhm.
on that front side. Those first 5 words are all based on kind of belief. And then we
Mhm.
get to contemplation, and that puts us at kind of that point or fulcrum point of, now we shift into behavior and how we change that behavior. And that first behavior is creativity.
Yeah.
And do you find that, sitting down to write a book kind of opened you up to becoming, kind of more deeply connected with yourself, but also with the people around you?
Oh, absolutely. And I remember in the process of writing this book, I just became like my senses became so much sharper. There's something about having to put your thoughts down on paper that you really become very observant. And to me, that's a total key to an abundant life is, are you taking in the world around you, using your vision, your hearing, your uh, sense of smell, your taste. I was mentioning before we got on together that I loved your recent podcast with the chef. And, I think experiencing food, and especially if you're dining around the table with other people, that can just be such an enriching experience.
It's amazing how much is really spiritual. And again, I
Yeah.
hope as I proceed with this podcast that people that are not tied to any specific faith and maybe don't even believe in a God or any of that kind of stuff
Hmm.
can still understand that they are spiritual. And we're all spiritual
Hmm.
beings, whether we link it to religion or faith or any of that kind of stuff, because we're all connected. And without that connection, without the relationships, really we're isolated. And how can there be any joy or enthusiasm in life?
Hmm. Hmm.
We got to find that wow.
Right. Um, I years ago I went to a conference and the speaker talked about, are you spiritually pregnant? And I thought that was a great image. And the way he described it was, if you're feeling kind of unsettled or stuck or just kind of full of so many things up here, and that could be a sign that you're spiritually pregnant, meaning you just need to let all those things out and give them up and see what the universe gives back to you. And I love that language, maybe because I'm a woman, I've been pregnant, but I think that it's kind of that idea of how much are you carrying around inside you? And we are meant to be in community, right? So if you can, and even just the magic, we've all experienced this, how much better we feel after we download all that stuff in our head with someone who is easy to talk to, someone we trust, and to kind of give birth to all those things, sort them out. Maybe some of them are wonderful ideas that you want to start nurturing and grow, but the idea of not carrying those heavy burdens by yourself.
And you talk them as heavy burdens, but sometimes I think a lot of it is just there's this seeds of growth and
Mm.
creativity that we hold inside of us because of our insecurities, our fears, the baggage that we've carried with us from other relationships and all those types of things. And that there's a certain
Mhm.
amount of vulnerability that comes with letting all of that out. And a question I was going to ask you before, you talked about the being spiritually pregnant was, did you feel that there was a certain level of vulnerability that came along with writing the book? Because, you're telling personal stories and,
Mhm.
you're
Mhm.
revealing much more of yourself and you're putting yourself on paper for hopefully tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people to read, right? And
Right,
oftentimes
right.
we write
Hmm.
for ourselves, but we're also,
Hmm.
in doing that, we're exposing ourselves to others. Did you feel that sense of vulnerability?
I did. I think especially when I first spoke, at my book launch or at a book club where I had to, I guess I realized people were reading this wherever they were living or reading it, but then to actually be in face to face with my readers and kind of tell some of these stories. But then what the blessing is of being authentic is you really get authenticity back. And so when I had a chance then to visit with people, they would share amazing stories. Some of them funny stories about their role models of aging or what their mom or dad did at a certain age or whatever. But also some of them just kind of the loss that they're experiencing now at this time of life and how they're overcoming that. And they love the positivity of the book. And I think a word that we haven't used yet, which to me is a very spiritual word, and that is hope. And where do we find? And you know, for me, I find hope in my faith practices, But I find hope again by turning outside myself and um, feeding my soul with beautiful music, or feeding my soul with uh, conversations with friends, or reading other people's writings, um, or just going out. And I have an example of this Monday. I don't know if you're familiar with a meal train, where
Mhm.
if somebody needs food, you sign up online. So I signed up online to bring soup on Monday to one of my friends who's had a long health journey. And to me, that's just a perfect little example of turning outside yourself and being creative, having this kind of holy moment, making this soup and then delivering it to a friend. And I can just anticipate that it's going to be a wonderful exchange with my friend. And that can feel so spiritual. And so it doesn't have to be anything complex, or as you said, you don't have to walk into church to get this feeling, but you certainly can. But I would encourage people, especially at this age of life, to try different things, to find new people that you maybe haven't hung out with before, that can help you become unstuck, if you will.
Yeah, it's funny you brought up hope. I'm a fan of the band Shinedown, which is kind of a more, I don't know how you would describe their rock, but they're kind of a bit more of an edgy rock band. And actually, I would love
Okay.
to have their lead singer on this podcast. So if he happens to be listening to
Mm.
this, you're invited. Just because, from what I've read and the music that I listen to, I find a lot of spirituality in music, as you were saying, and it can be in all
Hmm.
types of
Hmm.
music. But
Absolutely.
just thinking as I was driving home from work yesterday, I was listening to their song, and it's in the lyrics, it's like hope is
Mm.
not a four-letter word.
Oh, wow. That's
And it's
good.
like, oh,
Yeah.
okay, that's a pretty spiritual message there. And it's amazing how
Hmm.
if we can just
Hmm.
kind of keep our minds and our spirits connected and open, we're going to make those connections in life.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so, do you see connections between spirituality and the lack thereof with many of the issues we face in our society, like mental health, social isolation,
Hmm.
polarization?
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes the word like spiritual desert comes to mind, that kind of our world or our country is kind of just becoming a spiritual desert. Um, and again, I go back to, what is your heart pinned to? And I think as so many people, they almost try to kind of push that away. Well, you know, I'm I'm me, and we kind of become your own God, right?
Mhm.
Um, so I I think that if you would, I don't know, I'm sure somebody researches this, right? Uh, look at those people who are feeling better, who are feeling happy, who are feeling like that life has meaning. Um, if you would ask them questions related to body, mind, and spirit, I would think those people haven't ignored that spirituality, and there are things that can attack that. And I feel bad for today's youth. I think in a lot of ways they've probably been turned off to spiritual discussions, or attending church, or whatever. And then they end up kind of pinning their heart to some other things. But if we can um, help them find community, find a belonging, I think is so important. I think last time we might have talked about the prevalence of loneliness and what that does to people physically and mentally and spiritually. And so sometimes I think we have to, before we can help people with those big questions like spirituality, you just need to kind of get them out of themselves, get them in community, act, move. I think I'm sure you've seen this so often in your athletes, just the power of movement. The other night I was at a cast party because we had done a ballet last weekend. And most of the cast in the ballet were high school students. And so they were eating pizza, they were sitting on the floor, and they were talking. Then all of a sudden, the instructor turned on a ballet score from the Nutcracker, which they had danced in at Christmas time. And all of a sudden, they all just pop up and they're all just dancing around the room just with abandon. And they're smiling and they're interacting. And it just gave me such joy to watch what movement can do for a person's spirit. And so I think that's kind of the first step, maybe. We know we all need to move more, maybe maybe it's more in your court that you're the one that has to get us to all move.
Well, first thing I was going to ask you was, did you get up and dance with them?
Oh gosh. Okay, I'm busted. I did not. I just kind of sat and watched, and I was kind of jealous. That made me think, oh, I kind of wish I was 16 again. But we sure could have. There was a group of about 6 adults, and that is exactly what we should have done.
Exactly. I mean, that's what you should have done. And so
Mm-hmm.
I'll come back to kind of the question and with regard to movement. I might need refreshed on it to get back to that. But I was going to ask you, you mentioned these spiritual deserts, and, we
Mm-hmm.
see them on really both ends of the age spectrum. We're seeing it much more in our youth, but also, especially, from COVID, we saw this revealed in the older generation, what might be, our later third age entering closer to that fourth age where we're starting to get more socially isolated, we're getting more poor health, we're declining toward decrepitude, and we're getting closer and
Mm-hmm.
closer to death. That's when people tend to get the most isolated. And so how do we
Mm-hmm.
bridge those deserts? How do we kind of build a bridge across, maybe the green space that all of us are living in the middle of our lives between the youth and the elderly?
Yeah, and I I love any kind of intergenerational solution, and I think that happened much more naturally decades ago when we kids lived near their grandparents, and we lived in maybe a rural area where you were all even out working in the field together. So unfortunately, we've kind of put people in different silos, if you will. Um, so I think there are definitely programs out there and models where they intentionally uh, combine students with uh, older adults and get those relationships going. I would encourage any parent to adopt a grandparent if there's not one in your neighborhood. But I also just think we need to find some new solutions. And is technology uh, something that we should be looking at more? Um, Virtual reality, whatever it might be. But I think it's a challenge. But again, it comes back to I think two things for older adults to help them move through this stage of life. You need friends and you need purpose. And if you can take responsibility for that yourself, uh, that would be great. Pick up the phone, call somebody. Um, Maybe you aren't super mobile anymore, but you could. I am going to send cards to everybody who has reached out to me this year. I'm going to send a card back. So anything that you can do to again turn out of yourself and be a part of the world around you.
Perfect advice. And so, kind of back to your question about the movement, I think
Yeah.
the more I've taught exercise physiology, the more the physical has become more spiritual. I can't help
Yes.
but kind of incorporate a lot of, and again, this is why I'm so fueled to do this particular podcast, is because
Mm-hmm.
the more I engage with the physical, the more I have to embrace the spiritual. And whether we're looking at aging, whether we're looking at athletes, or just trying to maintain a level of health and longevity, we can't dismiss the spiritual piece. But the spiritual piece requires, like you said, some movement, but it also requires a bit more of the intellectual exploration and facing our emotions and what we might be
Mm-hmm.
dealing with in life. And, at the pinnacle, I always kind of describe wellness as more of a pyramid as opposed to the typical slices of a pie, because I don't
Mm-hmm.
feel like it's a pie. I feel like the physical and the spiritual really create the base of this pyramid, and they're interconnected. And the more we get into, as we explore our spiritual side and we explore the physical side, things start coming together, because you start looking at, well, what is spirit? And it's this space between the material. And physics is showing us that, how small the physical is getting, but eventually we get to this point where, okay, what's connecting the physical, and how are we all so interconnected? And so to me, that is
Mm-hmm.
such a solid base. But better understand it and better be able to utilize the physical and the spiritual, we have to kind of build on that intellectually. We have to be learners and we have to be studying, and you can't just sit in isolation. You're not going to grow spiritually or physically by sitting on your phone just watching TikTok, if they can still do that. I don't know if that's come back yet or not. Yeah. But and then from that, intellectual understanding, the spiritual and the physical understanding helps us to build a little bit better emotional IQ, if you would call it that. And then at the precipice of all that is our social connections. And that brings us all back to the spiritual and the physical, which allows us to keep kind of growing. And so I think none of that can be separated. But, if we're going to be social beings, we got to be spiritual beings as well. Otherwise, we're going to be living in unhealthy relationships where either somebody is taking advantage of us or we're taking advantage of another, or we're living in these destructive relationships rather than building relationships. I don't know if that answered kind of your question to me.
Right. And I'm sure people in your field have done research about this, but, I just would like to ask people, like, when are you the happiest? At what time do you feel like you're really getting that abundant life? And my guess is those stories always will revolve around other people. It'd be odd that someone would say, oh, it's when I'm in my, breakfast room by myself having a cup of coffee. I mean, it might be, but, So I think we need to be reflective, and maybe part of that is journaling. I think that would be a really good step for people. It's to and I've started doing that more. I try to do that every morning and just kind of write down what has meaning for me. What am I wondering about? Maybe a question I want to ask. So journaling can be really helpful. The other thing I think we haven't talked about yet, and it can be rather simple. Sometimes the simple things are the most helpful. Is we could focus on our breathing. And I have a friend who actually teaches breathing. And I'm sure you do this in your work as well, but just kind of that ability to really focus on our breathing and to experience what it feels like to really have a great intake of air and a slow exhale and kind of get into that rhythm. And I just think our bodies are just sort of on overdrive most of the time, and we need to find ways to calm ourselves and relax.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to the physical and the spiritual. I mean, that breathing, it can be meditative. It can help us to connect to ourselves spiritually, but also from a physical standpoint, it's kind of bringing us more into that parasympathetic nervous system, lowering our heart rate, lowering our blood pressure, and helping us to kind of deal with more of the stressors from a physiological and a spiritual perspective. So you can't separate the two. So.
No, you really can't. And I think that we are, even though the world is kind of crazy right now, we are fortunate to live in this age of technology where people can search for, breathing exercises or a podcast about loneliness or whatever, that all of this is kind of at your fingertips. But I think, again, it's a great thing to do with another person. Whether it be somebody, if you live with someone or friends, or start a group in your neighborhood, that'll always add more meaning to the experience.
Yeah, and you mentioned that we're kind of in a crazy point now in society, but I am much more optimistic, I think, than a lot of people, because I think, and again, going back to my spiritual and physical connection, I often will think of, what is required to see adaptation in the body. We have to put a certain level of stress on the body. And I talk in terms of, in exercise, about like maximum recoverable volumes and minimum effective volumes and those types of things in regards to the amount of training that we do. And sometimes, when we have the highest amount of stimulus, there's a choice there. You keep allowing it to go that way, or you get into a state of recovery and the body adapts. And I think where it might be called a turning point, so, the title of your book, Turning, I think we're at a turning in this country where, we have the opportunity to, I believe all this mess that we're in right now is going to ultimately bring us together. It's just part of the spiritual evolution of man that we have to go to these points of almost breaking And we realized that, we got to pull through this together, and there's going to be more positive change.
And I think that's where creativity happens, right? Or some really great problem solving is when we're sort of at almost the end of the rope. And then I think people rise up. You maybe somebody has a great idea, and it kind of feels like a safe time to sort of, well, let's throw this out there and see if this sticks, and so I think the important thing is to not be afraid. I think there's way too much fear. I have a wise nursing professor who always says that the opposite side of the coin from anger is fear. So if you're hearing people be angry, usually what's lying underneath that is fear. And so what's the antidote to fear? Well, we need to trust. We need to, gather facts. We need to be in conversation. We need to be in problem-solving mode. And once you experience the relief of that fear, I think that can be an incredibly spiritual moment.
And so, as a nurse, how did you experience, some of those kind of turnings in your patients? Where did you see the connection between, again, with nursing, a lot of people think it's going to be a purely physical occupation. It obviously became a bit more spiritual for you. Where did that turning occur?
I think it kind of goes back to your word about vulnerability, right? And I had the honor of being at the bedside of people when they're getting closer to death. And that kind of comes naturally, where people get really honest and they want to talk about things that have meaning to them and thank people who meant something to them. And so my wish is that we could somehow make that normative, right? Normative, that happens earlier in life, that we're not afraid to tell people what we think of them, or if somebody has meant something to you, be sure and share that with them. So I think for anyone who chooses nursing, that is an amazing gift to the nurse personally, is you see people throughout all those different phases of life, and you'll find some wonderful role models of aging, role models of spirituality, role models of hope, by just taking care of people and being with them at some of the most precious times of their life. Now, I realize that not everybody has that in their occupation, but you can get there with people if you ask the right questions. I used to, what matters most to you today? That's a great question. Or, so what is your heart pinned to? Maybe that's a little esoteric, but let's have some deep conversations and not be afraid of where those conversations might go.
And how do we initiate those conversations?
I think that's such a great question. I think it's first by listening. I think you could be kind of off-putting if you just sort of throw those things out right away, right? But, just say, what's your story today? Tell me what's on your mind. What's your story today? And kind of an open-ended question like that, and see where it goes. Listening, absolutely key. And a lot of us aren't very good about that. I know I even do that sometimes. I'm trying to think of the next thing I'm going to say. That happens a lot, even on a podcast, right? But to really listen to what the other person is saying and ask, or, say things like, tell me more about that. Or how did that make you feel? So just kind of become your own little podcast interviewer, I guess.
Sounds good. Yeah, I had this conversation recently. I don't know if it was on the other podcast or this podcast, but somewhere, or maybe it was in teaching, but the conversation came up about how we often, as Americans, we tend to pass somebody by and say, hey, how you doing? But we have no intention of waiting on an answer. And a lot of, people that I've interacted with that are from, other cultures, they take offense to that, because in their culture, you ask that, you're expecting an answer. And how do we get to that point where we actually ask the question and we wait for the answer? And if somebody asks us a question, we're willing to say, well, this is where I'm at. How do we get to that point?
Yeah, that's such a good observation. We had some good friends who relocated here from Bosnia after the Bosnian War. They were just wonderful friends. And whenever they would call me, uh, she would go through our whole family. How is Dan? How is Ian? All our children. It was one by one, and all these lovely questions. And then she would say, "Well, could you help me with this?" Or I was wondering about this. Whereas I would probably have called and just right away just ask the question, just let's get done, and now I even hear that it's not even kind or appropriate to call somebody on the phone. You are supposed to text them first and ask them, is it okay if we have a phone conversation? I mean, it's crazy. So we are putting up all these barriers to really connecting genuinely with people. So that's one thing I'd encourage people to just pick up a phone and not try to have a deep conversation through text messages, right? Uh, so I think again it goes back to listening, um, and I do think of my friend Aida, that's her name, Aida, that I'm going to try to start doing that when I talk to people. It's going to first be about how are you, and not what do I need from you.
That's a great approach, and I got to work on that
Hmm.
a little bit more too. I am
Oh,
one that
I
I
do too.
do tend to text somebody and say, "Hey, is this a good time to call?"
Hmm.
But it's not because I'm trying to put the conversation into a text message. It's just
Yeah.
you know usually calling people that are in other time zones, and
Hmm.
what might be
Hmm.
early for me, and the best time for me to make calls is like when I'm driving to work. But that's
Hmm.
sometimes 3 hours later for some people, and it might be in the middle of their work.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
do need to kind of pick up the phone and just call people more often. It's sad how little we use phones other than for texting.
Absolutely. When I was growing up on the farm in South Dakota, I remember every morning my dad would call his sister at, I think, 8:30 every morning. It was just a given. You knew that my dad was going to be on the phone. And I'm not sure if they had, what they talked about every day. So it was a lot of times it was just about the weather or whatever, but they found things to talk about. But what a wonderful routine. And, maybe some of those things that just like we're so routine about maybe our workouts or whatever we schedule each day, could you have a phone call slot in your calendar? Who am I going to call today and just have a conversation?
Yeah, I probably need more of those slots as well. I had gotten in the habit before they both passed. My dad and my mom, I mean, they were divorced, so I would call one of them first and then the other. But every Sunday I'd
Mhm.
be calling them, and really got in the habit of doing that. And after my
Mhm.
dad passed, it's really just now my stepmom. And so we have a habit of calling her every Sunday night. And
Mhm.
she's expecting it, and we're planning on it, and it's just kind of a fun time. The kids come on into the call, and we just kind of get on the speakerphone. And I was thinking as we were conversing earlier that I probably should ask her about, hey, maybe once in a while we could just do a FaceTime so that
Yeah.
everybody can see everybody. And that's where technology can kind of come in. But we've
Mhm.
lost the art of phone conversation. It's just nobody
Mhm.
calls anymore. And even within
Mhm.
my house, I'll get so frustrated with my wife and my kids where it's like they text me, I'm upstairs. It's
Oh
like, yell
gosh.
up to
Yeah.
me, tell me what you want. Don't text me.
Yeah.
Don't email me something. I want it, I want to hear it in
Mhm.
person. You're only a room away.
Mhm.
Either get up and come
Absolutely.
or call me because I'll come over. And so we
Yeah.
need
Yeah.
a little bit more of that. We need more personal connection. And
Right.
we've
Right.
lost that. I also think
Yeah.
we've lost the front porch. And I don't know if we talked about that in our previous
Oh my
conversation, but
gosh. No, but I have done some work on the front porch back in the day. I did some writing on that. And yeah, either the literal or figurative porch, right? Where just the neighbors come by and we're all hiding on our back decks. Yeah,
yeah, we don't build houses like that anymore.
exactly.
And
Yeah.
I grew up in a community where pretty much every house was, had a big front porch on it. And
Hmm.
there was a lot
Hmm.
of multi-generation, multicultural. I mean, I grew up, it was predominantly white community, but it was Italian, Polish, Greek,
Hmm.
and then those of us, the bland Scottish Irish in there. But,
Hmm.
I had friends, their grandmothers would be on that. You knew all their grandmothers, you knew the multi-generations. You walk down the street, people are watching out for other people's kids, so you didn't have that fear. And we walked to school.
Yes.
I mean, I was in elementary school where I had
Yeah.
friends that would have to walk at least a half mile to school, and then a half mile back for lunch, and then back to school, and then back home after school. And you had the grandmothers out there watching, and you knew people, and you had, you walk to the grocery store, and so you can, hey, let me help you carry those. And we just have lost so much of that in our communities.
Yeah, again, I think it comes back to, role modeling. If you can role model that to the younger generation, maybe we can repair some of this. I think it's also an intergenerational opportunity when you talk about grandmas watching, if you can find an older person in the neighborhood who, would you mind sitting on my front, or, maybe put a chair in your front yard if you don't have a porch or whatever, but just watch the kids while I run over and talk to the neighbor. I mean, we need to interact more and to just be open to what we can learn from other people.
Yeah, we bought a house in a cul-de-sac because, for a place for the kids to play and stuff, but we don't spend enough time out front because there's no porch. We lived in a community in Michigan before we moved to Oregon that it was a beautiful house. I miss that house so much because it had a big wraparound porch, and we lived on kind of a Y-shaped cul-de-sac. So the street came in and there were like two separate cul-de-sac points to it. But it was a very connected neighborhood. We could sit out. My sister got me rocking chairs for a wedding present. We'd sit out in those chairs, and kids would be out playing. You interact with all the neighbors when they're coming and going, and it was such a beautiful community. And we come to Oregon, they just don't put front porches on houses anymore, and so people are inside or they're on their back decks. I really miss that. So what other spiritual messages can you share from your experiences and from writing the book?
Well, I do kind of have the book divided up into kind of 3 sections, sort of body, mind, and spirit. And one of the chapters in my spiritual part, well, there's a couple of them that I think of. The one is called Wild Forgiveness. And I tell a story about coming home from work one day, and my garden that's on the side of my driveway, my husband was out there, and he had a big pile of green plants. And he stopped the car, and I yelled at him. I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I just pulled these weeds because they look terrible." And I go, "Those are my cosmos. They are about ready to bloom." And he, in his mind, thought they were weeds. So he pulled them all up and piled them up. And I was so angry with him. And I remember I just kind of held that over him for a long time. You know how you can do that. You can kind of just remind them way too often about what they did, and that, it hurt me, and it really was flowers, whatever. But somehow we need to harness that power of forgiveness and just give it away very freely. You talk about great songs, and I think this is the one by the Eagles, maybe. It has the word forgiveness. Even if we don't love each other anymore, still forgive, kind of a thing, I think is the lyric. But just so if there's been broken relationships or whatever, at some point, once you do forgive, I think that's a very spiritual practice. And it's a spiritual practice for the person receiving, but it's also a spiritual practice for you. You can't carry those things around, again, some of those rocks that weigh us down. So I talk about that. And then another one, and I'm going to tilt my camera here because I don't know if you can see this up here. I should grab it. I have a spirit animal. I don't know, Jeff, do you have a spirit animal? I'm going to grab it.
I've not really thought about my spirit animal. I don't know.
That could be a fun question, too, about spirituality. So this is a mountain goat. And I don't know if you have mountain goats in Oregon. I bet you do. We have mountain goats in South Dakota in the Black Hills. But my girlfriend gave me this because there's a chapter in my book about my spirit animal, a mountain goat. And what I love about a mountain goat is that they have these little paws that are like suction cups. And so if you've ever seen a video of like a mountain goat or got to watch one in the wild, they can climb up like the highest mountain. And because they have these suction cups, so they know how to cling to the mountain. And the reason it's my spiritual animal is because that's what faith does for me, or my spirituality. I cling to that. So whenever I'm having to climb a mountain, whether it's a really hard problem or a bad event that happened in my life or a bad relationship, I know that I can cling to my faith, that I can cling to my spirituality, I can cling to that greater being in my life, that it doesn't have to depend on me, that it's something that I know is always there. And so there's lots of great animals analogies. You could pick something other than a mountain goat, but I like to use that a lot in my talks. I encourage people to be a mountain goat and cling to a higher being.
Yeah, I have to give some thought to my spirit animal. And I was just trying to think, my son and I have had a conversation about this kind of recently. And I want to say that he kind of presented his as being like a polar bear or something like that. And it goes
Okay.
back to some of our deeper roots kind of beyond Scotland back into Scandinavia, because the Armstrongs
Mm-hmm.
and a lot of the Scots really come from Nordic lands, as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
we often think of more like Central Europe and things like that. But I don't know what mine would be. I have to really give thought to that. The only thing that really came to mind as you pulled on your little stuffed animal was a penguin, because I'm a huge Monty Python fan, and I've
Oh.
always, for years, had a penguin on the television, because it's one of their
Mm-hmm.
sketches where it's like the two of them are sitting there and like, what's the penguin doing on the telly? And it ends up blowing up. And so it's this whole big kind of Monty Python sketch. And so for years,
Yeah.
I had a friend that years ago gave me a stuffed penguin, just because of that little joke, and I had it on my TV forever. And I think it kind of got away from it once I had to grow up and get married and everything. But we had
Yeah, but I
my,
think if you dig into penguins a little more, there's probably some great role models for community, how they live in
yeah.
community, how they survive adverse conditions. And
Yeah, and they both, both take responsibility for raising the kid,
yes.
the
Mm-hmm.
babies, and
Mm-hmm.
yeah. So maybe it is a penguin. I don't know. I'll have to explore it more. It doesn't sound, that's not a really sexy spirit animal. What's your spirit animal? Oh,
Doesn't sound real
penguin.
strong.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
A lot of people in South Dakota, I think, would say the bison or the buffalo. And what's great about them is they will just stand and face the wind. They always stand and face into the wind, whether it's in the summer or the snow or whatever. And so it becomes a great role model for facing your problems or facing your fears. And just look right at it. Yeah.
See, that's probably a better spirit animal for me. That's how I am. I think that
Hmm.
steadfastness, facing
Hmm.
your problems, generally a fairly gentle animal, but
Hmm.
dangerous when they charge.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
I would lean maybe to that more than a penguin, but
Okay.
I'll have to
That's
explore that a
great.
little bit more. Maybe that'll be a future episode of this, is just, exploring my spiritual animal. But that's awesome. So was it presented to you that that was your spirit animal, or did you just kind of realize it along your path?
I think it was in the process of writing my book, and a lot of it I was doing kind of in isolation because it was during COVID, and I was up here in my office, and I I don't honestly I don't know how I came across it, but once I started digging into it, and I was ordering books off Amazon about mountain goats and watching YouTube videos, and I mean it's crazy. Like if you YouTube a mountain goat and how they take care of their kids, literally kids, and what the where they can traverse, and it's amazing.
Yeah.
It's a great
And
role model. Yeah,
you see them walking on these paths in the mountainside that are like about an inch wide, and it's like,
yeah,
how do they do
absolutely.
that? So
Yeah.
that's a great analogy and a great spirit animal. So
You can use it too. I won't care.
no, I don't know. I don't see myself as a mountain goat, but
Mhm.
I'm kind of like in the
I think I
buffalo.
need to send you a bison, as we call them in
Yeah.
South Dakota.
Well, technically, that's what they are bison. I think we
Correct. Hmm.
inappropriately call them buffaloes, because buffaloes are
Yeah.
more like the water buffaloes, and it's a different animal. And I
Hmm.
love bison meat, so I don't
Yeah,
know. Can you?
absolutely.
Does that make you a cannibal if you eat your spirit animal?
Ooh, I don't know about that. Yeah,
Spiritual cannibalism. I don't know. That's a whole nother topic.
right.
So, what practices or tools, whether spiritual, secular, or scientific, do you believe can really help individuals address some of the spiritual and existential struggles that we're facing in our lives?
Uh, I think getting out of your head is one of the best things. I think just listening to your own voice, usually that's kind of not the most positive voice you can have in your head, right? So going to different resources, for me, it would be the scriptures, or it might be some favorite authors. I just started a new book called The Artist's Way. Very excited about it. It's going to teach me all about increasing my creativity. I think just sometimes getting out of your routine. One thing I kind of like to say about retirement is that it can be the end of repetition. And so rather than sort of having this day of getting up, going to work, coming home, taking the kids somewhere, trying to get them to bed and just repeat, that this third act of life can be a wonderful opportunity to just change things up. And so maybe just in the changing things up, which usually involves movement, maybe a change of energy, I think you will find the spiritual moments in that. And we haven't even talked about gratefulness. That can be a wonderful thing at the end of the day, really doing a little journal entry on what was I grateful for today. So I guess in general, it would be kind of going back to my thesis of turning outside of yourself and seeing what the world needs from you, not being afraid to approach somebody and to meet someone new. Through those stories, my guess is your energy will rise, and that's a spiritual moment in itself. In this new book that I'm reading about the artist's way, she uses the term spiritual electricity. And I love that phrase. And how do you tap into that spiritual electricity? And a lot of times it is by doing something new, creating something, or conversing with someone on a meaningful level. So somehow find that spiritual electricity through, again, it's oftentimes through an external word, an external voice, an external person relationship that ends up changing you internally and changing your spirit.
Right, so we probably should be wrapping this podcast up a little bit. I know I could talk to you for hours, and we'll probably have to have you back on again, especially as the new book comes out. But,
yes, thanks.
With the other podcasts, it's very easy for me to just end it with a tagline. But for this podcast, I like to just kind of have the guest kind of end it with some of their own words of wisdom. So for listeners who are struggling with their own sense of purpose or meaning, maybe those who are struggling with entering into that third act of life, what is one small step they can take today to start addressing that?
Just do something new. Do something you haven't done before. That's what I would say.
Right.
And it doesn't have to be big. It can be, go to a different coffee shop, whatever. Say hello to a neighbor you haven't met yet. But just open yourself up in that way. And I know there's some fear involved in that, or definitely just simply fear. But once you start making those small steps and addressing that fear, then you'll be willing to do bigger things. Who knows? A year from now, you might end up skydiving or something like that. But start small, but do something new.
That's awesome. We're just going to end with that. I just want to, Becky, just thank you for being on the podcast today, sharing your insights. Being a nurse who is now kind of shifting the gears in how you care for other people. I'll just tell you, just keep taking care of yourself and caring for others.
Thank you. You as well.